Now that we've created those first 4 parts, we can use them to make an assembly of the actual Lego helicopter. The first thing that we need to do is make sure we've got all 4 of those parts open. So you can either just drag them into SolidWorks, or you can open them in SolidWorks normally. Now once your parts are open, you can switch between your open windows by pressing Ctrl and Tab. So you see we've got all 4 of them open. Now before we actually start making the assembly, we need to just have a little think about which part we're going to start with. You might think that the best one to start with is this large side part of the fuselage, the large right angle beam. But actually, if we look ahead in the instructions, we can see that this green connector is right at the center of the model. So it's probably best if we line that up with the center of the assembly. This will just help us later on if we need to mirror any parts over to the other side. So go to this green friction pin with bore part, and then from within that part, let's go to File, Make Assembly from Part. We're now taken to an empty blank assembly, and you should see your 4 open documents here on the left. And these are just parts that are open in SolidWorks. So if you don't see your parts there, you can just click Browse here at the bottom, and you can find the parts wherever they're saved on your computer. So firstly, we need to select the part that we want, which is the friction pin with bore. Left click to select that. And then I'm going to go down a little bit, and I'm going to select Graphics Preview here. This just means that when we move the mouse into the graphics area, we'll be able to see that part following the mouse around and see where it will be positioned. Now let's make sure the part is rotated to the correct orientation. You should see this small rotate menu, and you can use these buttons to rotate your part by 90 degrees in different directions. If you don't see that menu, just scroll down a little bit and make sure you have a check mark in this box, Show Rotate Context Toolbar. So let's rotate the part around so it matches the orientation in the Lego instructions. So we want this hole through the middle to be pointing directly upwards instead of pointing forwards. So we want to rotate around the X-axis, so I'm going to click this X button, and now that hole is facing directly upwards. And then let's place this part anywhere in the graphics area by left clicking. This part is now inserted into the assembly, and we can see that it's fixed because there's a small F in brackets next to the part in the parts tree. Also, if we try and drag the part around, we get a small message that says the component's fixed and it can't be moved. However, if we go to a top view and we look at the default planes, we can actually see that the right plane isn't lined up with the middle of the part. So this isn't really what we want. So we need to make it so this part is free to move around, and then we can put it in the right place and fix it there. To do this, first go over to the friction pin part with bore on the left and right click on the part, and from the menu choose Float. This will unfix the part, so we can now move it around, and we can see that that F for fixed has disappeared from next to the part name, and it's now been replaced by a minus, which means the part isn't fixed. We can now expand the part, and we can line up the planes from the part with the planes from the assembly. Let's start off with the front plane from the part, so select the front plane, and then hover over the default planes in the assembly, and there should be one that's roughly lined up with that front plane. So in my case, it's the top plane. If we hold down Control, we can select both of those planes, the front plane from the part and the top plane from the assembly. Then if you release Control, we can add a coincident mate, and that will line those 2 planes up. Then let's choose the next one, the top plane in the part, and then hold down Control and select the front plane in the assembly, and then release Control and add another coincident mate. And then finally, let's do the same with the right plane in the part and the right plane in the assembly. And now we can see that we no longer have that minus symbol next to the part name. So now it is fully defined, and we can also see it says fully defined down here on the right. And now if we go to top view, we can see we've got the right plane of the assembly at the middle of that part. So this will just make things much easier if we need to mirror over any parts from one side of the chopper to the other side. Now that we've fixed that first part in place, let's insert the remaining 3 parts. You can do this by going to the Assembly tab and choosing Insert Components. We can see we've got those other parts open there. Again, if you don't have them there, you can click Browse and just find them on your computer. Now before I insert the parts, I'm just going to click on this pin icon here. This just pins this menu open, so it means we don't have to reopen it every time we want to insert a new part. So firstly, I'm going to insert the axle part, and I'm going to use those rotation buttons to just rotate it around to the correct orientation so it lines up with the Lego instructions, and then I'm going to left click to place it in roughly the correct position. You don't have to rotate it at this stage, it just makes things a little bit easier when we add the mates later on. The next part I'm going to insert is that corner beam, and again I'm going to rotate it around to the correct orientation and then place it in roughly the correct place. And then finally I'm going to add the friction pin, and again rotate it around so it's in the correct orientation. And then when you're done, you can press OK to close that Insert Components menu. Now we can see we've got all the parts that we need in the assembly. The only one that's fixed is the green one. The other 3 parts have all got a small minus next to them in the parts tree, and that just shows that they're not defined and we can move them around in space. Now we can start to add some mates to fully define those other parts in the assembly. With Lego, it is fairly easy to see how parts fit together, so the mates are fairly easy to add. For the first one, let's attach the beam to the center connector. All we need to do is select a circular edge of the peg on that connector, and then select a circular face or edge on the corresponding hole that goes into on the beam. Remember, if you hold down Control, you can select these multiple items. We know from the instructions that the hole we need is the 5th one along from the front, so it should be this one. So when you have your 2 circular faces or edges selected, release Control, and then from the menu that pops up, we can add a concentric mate, which is this one with 2 circles on it. If you can't see that pop up for any reason, you can also choose the mate tool up here on the assembly tab, and then you can add a concentric mate there. So now that we've added that first concentric mate, the hole in the beam is lined up with the peg on the connector, but we can still rotate the beam and we can still move it in and out. So we need to add more mates. Firstly, let's zoom in and let's choose that flat face on top of the connector, hold down Control, and also choose a corresponding face on the beam. So I'm going to choose this large flat face on the top of the beam. I'm going to release Control, and then I'm going to add a parallel mate. And then finally, let's just move the beam in to the correct distance from the connector. So if we spin the assembly round, we want the outside of the connector to be lined up with the outside of the beam. So let's select those 2 sets of faces and add a coincident mate. And now we can see here next to the corner beam part in the parts tree, we no longer have that minus. So that means that part is now fully defined. We can also expand the mates folder here at the bottom, and we can see all of the mates that we've added if you need to adjust them or delete them for any reason. And now it's just a case of adding the mates for the remaining parts. Next up, let's move on to the axle. At first glance, this one looks a little bit tricky because of the shape, but actually if you remember, these top edges are curved. And we've also got the curved edge in the corresponding hole on the beam. So we can line those up using a concentric mate again. So I'm going to select that curved edge on the axle, also select a curved edge on the beam, and then add a concentric mate. Now if we move the axle around, we can see that it can actually still spin around in the hole, and that wouldn't be able to happen in real life. So we need to lock the rotation of it. We can do this pretty easily just by selecting one of the flat faces on the axle, and then selecting a corresponding flat face on the hole in the beam. Then you could add a parallel mate. In terms of the left-right position, we want the axle to be completely lined up in the center of the assembly. So what we can do is expand the axle part on the left in the parts tree. Then let's find the plane that goes down the middle of the axle. So that should be the front plane. Then let's make that coincident with the corresponding plane of the assembly, which is the right plane. And now we can see that the axle is also fully defined and it's lined up in the center of the model. Then finally, we'll just add some mates to that final friction pin connector. So I'm going to move it to roughly the correct place. I'm going to select a circular edge on the pin, hold down Control, and also select a circular edge on the hole that it goes into, and then we can add that concentric mate. And then on the bottom here, I'm going to select this face on the pin, and then this face on the connector. I'm going to make those coincident. Now if we look in the parts tree, we can see we've still got a minus next to that friction pin part. So that means it's not fully defined. And that's because we haven't actually locked the rotation. That pin can still spin around within the hole. This doesn't really matter within the model, but if you want to lock it in place just for completeness, then you can do that pretty easily, just by adding something like a parallel mate between one of these straight edges on the pin and say a straight edge on the beam. And now we can see that all 4 of our parts are fully defined, and then down here on the right, it says the whole assembly is fully defined. So now well done, we've completed the first stage of the Lego chopper. At this point, we can save the assembly by pressing Ctrl S or clicking the save icon. And I'm going to call it something like Stage 1 Lego Helicopter, just because it's the first stage of the instructions. And then I'm also just going to add that number that we've added to all of the other parts from the kit, 30465. So we have our assembly all saved there, and we've completed the first stage. In the next section, we'll move on to stage 2 of the instructions, and for that we'll be creating 3 new parts, but 2 of them are very similar to parts that we've already created. So we should be able to make those pretty quickly.